In late 1775, the American Revolution was just getting started, a fragile rebellion basically clinging to life around Boston. The Continental Congress, feeling bold but also pretty desperate, looked north to Canada. They didn't see a British stronghold, but a potential new partner, a future 14th colony. They figured the French-speaking Canadiens living there must have hated being under British rule just as much as they did. George Washington himself wrote letters, not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, inviting the oppressed inhabitants of the province of Quebec to join the cause. But letters only go so far. The revolutionaries knew that to truly secure their northern flank and bring Canada into the fold, they'd have to take it. What came next was one of the most audacious and brutal campaigns of the entire war. A two-pronged invasion, dreamed up with incredible ambition, carried out in desperation, and destined for a catastrophic, bloody end in the middle of a Canadian winter. This is the story of that insane plan, the story of two of America's most ambitious generals, a desperate mission to conquer Quebec, a brutal march through the wilderness, and a fatal gamble that turned the very people the Americans hoped to free against them. Picture this, it's New Year's Eve, 1775. A starving, frost-bitten army of American rebels is huddled outside the stone walls of Quebec City in a blinding blizzard. Their plan is audacious, maybe even insane: capture the city and bring the province of Quebec into the revolution. Led by two of America's most ambitious generals, Benedict Arnold and Richard Montgomery, they just survived a nightmare march through an unforgiving wilderness that took out a huge portion of their men before a single shot was even fired. Now, they were about to risk it all on one final, desperate assault. This is the story of that gamble, and how it all went so tragically wrong. The road to Quebec didn't start with armies, it started with politics. Back in 1774, the British Parliament passed the Quebec Act. On the surface, it seemed pretty enlightened. It gave Catholics religious freedom and restored French civil law. But to the fiercely Protestant, English-speaking colonies to the south, it was one of the intolerable acts. They saw it as a trick to keep Canada loyal to the king and a dangerous step towards absolute rule. The Continental Congress was convinced the Canadians had to be just as angry about it as they were. That assumption was optimistic. Sure, some merchants in Montreal and folks in the countryside were sympathetic to the American cause. But the powerful Catholic clergy and the land-owning seigneurs? They sided with the British, who guaranteed their power and traditions. The average person mostly just tried to stay out of it, wary of picking a side in someone else's fight. But the Americans couldn't afford a neutral Canada. A British-held Quebec was a dagger pointed straight at New York, a perfect staging ground for an invasion from the north. So, if Canada wouldn't join the revolution, it had to be taken. The plan Congress approved was bold, a two-pronged invasion to capture the key cities of Montreal and Quebec. One force would be led by Major General Richard Montgomery, an Irish-born ex-British officer with a great record. His would be the professional attack, moving up the well-known route via Lake Champlain. The other attack was way more radical, a real testament to the revolutionary mindset of doing the impossible because you have to. This second force, about 1,100 men, would be led by a fiery, ambitious colonel from Connecticut, a guy already famous for helping take Fort Ticonderoga, Benedict Arnold. His mission? Lead his men on a brutal, 350-mile trek through the dense, rugged wilderness of Maine. The idea was they'd emerge from the forest like ghosts and strike Quebec from a direction no one would ever expect. It was a plan that looked brilliant on paper but would turn out to be a descent into a frozen hell. Richard Montgomery's campaign started out like a textbook 18th century operation. He was a gentlemanly commander, respected by everyone. His force of roughly 1,500 men moved out from Fort Ticonderoga in September 1775 and laid siege to the British fort at St. Jean. The British governor of Quebec, Guy Carleton, a sharp and capable guy, tried to raise a militia to help the fort, but found the Canadians weren't interested in fighting for the crown. After a tough 45-day siege, Fort St. Jean surrendered on November 3rd. With the main British defense shattered, the road to Montreal was wide open. Carleton, realizing the city was impossible to defend, evacuated his few regular troops and fled down the St. Lawrence River, barely escaping capture himself. On November 13th, Montgomery's army marched into Montreal without a fight. He'd just captured Canada's biggest city. But his victory was shaky. His army was made up of guys with short-term enlistments, and a lot of them figured their job was done. Disease was spreading, and the Canadian winter was coming. Montgomery knew he had to push his luck. He had to take Quebec. Meanwhile, way out to the east, Benedict Arnold's expedition was fighting a totally different war, not against soldiers, but against nature itself. On September 25, his 1,100 men, including a tough company of Virginia riflemen led by the giant Daniel Morgan, pushed their heavy, poorly-made wooden boats, called bateaux, into Maine's Kennebec River. Arnold was using flawed maps from the French and Indian War and optimistically thought the trip would take 20 days. The reality was a nightmare. The boats, made from green wood, started leaking right away, ruining precious gunpowder and food. The rivers were a chaotic mess of rapids and waterfalls, forcing the men to portage, carrying their 100-pound boats and all their gear through thick mud and over rocky hills. It rained constantly. One soldier wrote in his journal about the misery of being all day in the water. By late October, they were starving. They'd eaten their last bits of flour and pork. They started eating whatever they could find, leather from their shoes, cartridge boxes, soap, even their sled dogs. Sickness, smallpox, dysentery, pneumonia, tore through the ranks. The army started to fall apart. One of Arnold's officers, Lieutenant Colonel Roger Ennis, lost his nerve. He argued the mission was doomed, turned his whole division around, almost a third of Arnold's force, and went home, taking way more than his share of the supplies with him. For the men who kept going, it was a pure test of will. They staggered through what they called the direful howling wilderness, their bodies skeletal and their clothes in rags. Finally, on November 9th, 6 weeks after they started, the ghostly, emaciated figures of Benedict Arnold and about 600 to 700 survivors emerged from the forest onto the south shore of the St. Lawrence River. Across the water were the stone walls of Quebec. They had pulled off a feat of endurance that people would later compare to Hannibal crossing the Alps. But the question was, what could this broken, starving army possibly do now? Arnold's arrival was a huge shock to Quebec. Governor Carleton had been so focused on Montgomery that he'd left the capital almost defenseless. But Arnold's force was way too weak to attack. They had almost no gunpowder and not a single cannon. Still, in a show of pure guts, Arnold ferried his men across the St. Lawrence, lined them up on the Plains of Abraham, where the British had beaten the French in 1759, and demanded the city surrender. The British responded by firing a cannonball at his messenger. Outgunned and outnumbered by the city's militia, Arnold had to retreat. It was a humiliating moment, but his incredible march wasn't for nothing. On December 2nd, General Montgomery arrived from Montreal with his own small force of just over 300 men. The rest of his army was either sick, had gone home, or was needed to garrison Montreal. But he brought captured British supplies, warm winter clothes, and most importantly, cannons. The two armies were finally united. Together, they had around 1,200 men facing an estimated 1,800 British regulars and militia inside the fortress of Quebec. Their opponent, Governor Carleton, had learned from history. He wasn't about to make the same mistake the French General Montgomery had made in 1759 by meeting his enemy on an open field. He was going to stay behind his walls, save his supplies, and let the Americans' real enemies, smallpox and the brutal Canadian winter, do the work for him. Montgomery started a siege, but it was mostly for show. His little cannons just bounced off Quebec's massive stone walls. And all the while, the clock was ticking. The enlistments for many of Arnold's men were up on December 31st. After that, a big chunk of his army could just pack up and leave. Disease kept spreading through the camp. In a letter, Arnold complained that not 1/4 are fit for duty. Feeling desperate, Montgomery saw only one way out: a direct assault on the city. He knew the risks. Attacking a fortified city was practically suicide, but waiting was a sure way to lose. The plan was as daring as it was desperate. They would attack in the dark during a blizzard, hoping the snow would hide their approach. It would be another two-pronged attack. Montgomery would lead a column from the south, and Arnold would lead a larger one from the north. They'd meet in the city's lower town, then storm the walls into the upper town. The men scribbled liberty or death on slips of paper and stuck them in their hats. On the night of December 30th, a howling blizzard descended on Quebec. This was it. In the pitch-black, pre-dawn hours of December 31st, 1775, the blizzard was raging. Snow and wind hammered the American columns as they moved out. Montgomery led his men along a narrow, icy path at the base of the cliffs, the frozen St. Lawrence grinding beside them. They managed to cut through a wooden stockade. The defenders had already fled. Victory felt so close. Montgomery drew his sword and surged toward a small blockhouse guarding the pass. "Push on, brave boys," he yelled, "Quebec is ours." Inside that blockhouse, a handful of terrified British militia and sailors held their ground. As the Americans appeared out of the swirling snow, they unleashed a storm of grapeshot and musket fire. Richard Montgomery was killed instantly. The general who had conquered Montreal was dead. Panic ripped through the column. Without their leader, the will to fight just vanished. Colonel Donald Campbell, Montgomery's second-in-command, immediately ordered a retreat. The southern attack had completely collapsed. On the other side of the city, Benedict Arnold's column of 600 men was having more luck, but paying a heavy price. They navigated the narrow, winding streets of the lower town, dragging a small cannon that they quickly had to abandon in the deep snow. As they neared the first major barricade, British defenders on the walls above opened up a hellish fire. Arnold, always leading from the front, was hit in the leg by a musket ball that shattered the bone. He collapsed in the snow and had to be carried to the rear, turning command over to Daniel Morgan. Morgan, the fierce Virginia frontiersman, was in his element. He grabbed a ladder, propped it against the barricade, and urged his riflemen on. He was knocked down once but climbed again, rolling under a cannon to dodge bayonets. His men poured over the wall right behind him. After a short, brutal fight, the first barrier was theirs. Morgan and his men roared in triumph, thinking the city was as good as won. They charged deeper into the maze-like streets, but the blizzard that was supposed to be their cover now became their trap. Lost in the storm, they had no idea where to go next. That hesitation was fatal. Governor Carleton, knowing the southern attack had failed, could now throw all his forces at Arnold's column. He sent troops to seal the street behind Morgan, trapping the Americans. When Morgan's men reached a second barricade, they were met with a devastating wall of musket fire from regulars and militia. The Americans were caught in a brutal crossfire with nowhere to run. They fought on for hours with incredible bravery, but their ammunition ran low. One by one, groups were forced to give up. Finally, surrounded and with no hope of help, a defeated Daniel Morgan had to surrender. In one last act of defiance, he refused to hand his sword to a British officer, giving it instead to a Canadian priest. By 10 a.m., it was all over. It was a complete and utter disaster for the Americans. The Battle of Quebec is a story of incredible bravery and tragic failure. It's a complex and often overlooked chapter of the American Revolution. If you want to learn more about the fascinating and often contradictory figures from this era, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. And let us know in the comments, what other forgotten battles of the Revolution do you think deserve their own story? The American losses at Quebec were catastrophic. Roughly 60 Americans were killed or wounded, and over 400 were captured, including the charismatic Daniel Morgan. The British, in contrast, suffered fewer than 20 casualties. Benedict Arnold, badly wounded, refused to quit. With the pathetic remains of his army, he kept up a weak, pointless siege of the city all winter, a testament to his sheer stubbornness. But the American dream of adding Quebec to their union was dead. In May 1776, the spring thaw brought British ships up the St. Lawrence carrying 4,000 reinforcements, with thousands more on the way. The remaining American forces, ravaged by smallpox and completely demoralized, finally abandoned the siege and began a long, humiliating retreat back to New York. The invasion of Canada was the Continental Army's first major strategic defeat. It was a harsh lesson in the realities of war, a lesson about logistics, the dangers of overconfidence, and the fact that you can't just export a revolution. The assumption that the Canadians would eagerly join them was a profound miscalculation. While some had helped, the American occupation, particularly in Montreal, had soured relations and pushed many Canadians toward neutrality or a reluctant acceptance of British rule. Quebec remained a secure British base for the rest of the war. But the legacy of the campaign is also one of incredible human drama. It made Richard Montgomery one of the Revolution's first great martyrs. And for Benedict Arnold, this was the peak of his heroism. His leadership and unbelievable courage at Quebec are what make his later treason so much more tragic and complicated. He was a man who sacrificed everything to take Quebec for America, long before he would try to sell West Point to the British. The insane plan to conquer Canada had failed, but the echoes of that desperate, bloody New Year's Eve in the snow would be felt for the rest of the war.